I'm going to briefly introduce Dan and his book. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll get to questions and discussion. So Dr. Daniel Martínez is a distinguished scholar and associate professor in the School of Sociology at the University of Arizona. He is also the co-director of the Binational Migration Institute that is housed in the Department of Mexican American Studies. His scholarly interests include race and ethnicity, undocumented immigration, and criminalization. Dr. Martínez has conducted extensive research on deportation and undocumented border crosser deaths along the U.S. Mexico border. He is the principal investigator of the Migrant Border Crossing Study, a Ford Foundation-funded research project that we're going to hear about today. Dan's co-edited book critically examines the consequences of the current approach to border and immigration enforcement. That approach, as the book describes, has produced unheard levels of violence, very high death rates, and a mass incarceration machine that has been criminalizing migrants and locking up asylum seekers in for-profit prisons, whose owners are among those that lobby for increased enforcement and harsher penalties. The book is based on interviews with 1,600 people who were deported to Mexico. And, quote, an attempt is made to reclaim the conversation and challenge the fact-free, racially driven fear tactics that currently dominate the political field. This book is extremely important for many reasons, including it centers migrant experiences, and also the authors consulted with activists, advocates, NGOs, and others to find out what information they needed in order to do their work and make change. It is an honor to hear from Dr. Martínez about this book. So let's welcome Dan and hear his presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. Just to make sure everybody can hear me okay. Okay, sounds great. So as mentioned, my name is Dan Martínez. I'm a distinguished scholar and associate professor in the School of Sociology, and I also serve as the co-director of the Binational Migration Institute in the Department of Mexican American Studies here at the U of A. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about our edited volume, The Shadow of the Wall. What I want to just communicate is that this edited volume was essentially a snapshot of several ongoing projects that me and my colleagues Jeremy Slack and Scott Whiteford have had over the years, right? So the first thing I want to point to is just our table of contents. As you can see, we cover quite a bit of terrain here. I'm happy to speak to any of these chapters throughout today's presentation, but what I'm going to be focusing on mostly today are going to be on our research methods, as well as Chapter 4 in Harm's Way, Family Separation, Immigration Enforcement, which we then essentially built upon in a recent International Migration Review article that was published a couple of years back. I'm also going to be sharing some data that were not necessarily provided in the book, but I think really helps paint a broader picture of what, at the time when we were in the field, migrants were experiencing along the U.S. Mexico border. But before I get into the projects, I want to spend a little time just contextualizing how this study came about. Okay, so I actually had the opportunity to, first I came to the University of Arizona as a graduate student in 2004. At the time, I did not have a background in immigration studies. My background as an undergraduate was in economics and Spanish, and I minored in Chicano studies and ethnic studies. But I had decided to pursue a master's degree in Mexican American studies because I was really interested in learning more about migration. And I think a lot of this stems from my own personal history, migrating to the United States as a young child and being, raised by a father who was an immigrant, and just witnessing some of the battles that he dealt with in terms of just day-to-day life in the United States. I was also very interested in understanding why, my mother is a U.S. citizen, and though I was born in Mexico, I was a natural born citizen. Why, by virtue of just birth to a U.S. citizen mother, was I able to just literally get on a plane and come to the United States when those same opportunities aren't afforded to other people who are also looking for a better life abroad, right? So anyways, I came to the University of Arizona in 2004, and at the time I had an opportunity to work on a research project with my mentor, Raquel Rubio Goldsmith, who I understand was actually BorderLink's first treasurer back in the day. So there's some interesting connections there. But we had an opportunity to work on a project looking at undocumented border crosser deaths here in Southern Arizona. Right. So for those of you that don't know, the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner here in Tucson, Arizona, investigates all unattended non-natural deaths, regardless of the person's citizenship status, national origin. If somebody passes away in Pima County and some of the adjacent counties, Pima County Office of Medical Examiner is called to the scene to recover the remains and to investigate that death and to work to identify the individual and reunite the remains with their loved ones, right? So we're very fortunate to have the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner here in Tucson. They have developed what I think is the gold standard when it comes to investigating migrant deaths along the U.S. Mexico border. No other entity like it exists in the United States, right? So we have a very clear understanding of what's going on with border crosser deaths here in Southern Arizona that we don't necessarily have in other areas of the border, right? And a lot of this is because of the leadership of people like Dr. Bruce Anderson, Dr. Bruce Parks, Dr. Greg Hess, and other medical investigators and medical examiners who have committed several past years to investigating these deaths. So we had this opportunity to review medical examiner reports and medical and autopsy reports of migrants who tried to cross the U.S. Mexico border and died in the process. And so what we found, first and foremost, is that we saw this notable increase in migrant deaths here in Southern Arizona starting in roughly 2000, right? And so for those of you that may not be familiar, this is a direct consequence of border enforcement efforts, of increased border militarization efforts stemming from the prevention through deterrence strategy. So in 1994, the U.S. Border Patrol implemented this prevention through deterrence strategy, which was largely based on a pilot program that started in the El Paso sector in 1993, Operation Blockade or Operation Hold the Line. The basic idea here was to try to deter undocumented immigration by heavily militarizing traditional urban crossing points. So this started first in El Paso, Juarez, and it was deemed quote unquote an overnight success because from one year to the next, the El Paso sector experienced a notable decrease in apprehensions in the sector, right? Well, it didn't take a genius to realize that what was happening is that these increased border militarization efforts were simply funneling undocumented immigrants into more remote and less patrolled areas, such as Southern Arizona. So building off of that supposed success of the Operation Blockade or Operation Hold the Line in the El Paso sector, the Border Patrol implemented this broader prevention through deterrence strategy, which again was aimed at trying to heavily enforce traditional urban crossing corridors such as El Paso Juarez, San Diego Tijuana, Nogales, and then Brownsville Matamoros. And here in Southern Arizona, as part of the prevention through deterrence strategy, we had Operation Safeguard. Operation Safeguard was implemented in 1995, expanded in 1997, but we didn't necessarily see resources materialize on the ground until 1999. And it was that following fiscal year that we saw migrant deaths began to increase here in Southern Arizona, right? So the increase in migrant deaths here in Southern Arizona was a direct consequence of border enforcement efforts that funneled undocumented immigration into more remote areas such as Southern Arizona. So that was one finding that we came across in this study. The second finding is that we essentially found that death types weren't random, right? Rather, they were patterned, and they're patterned by not only seasonality, but also according to migrants' demographic characteristics. At the time, as a graduate student, I wasn't very familiar with the migration literature, but I thought this likely had to do with how people's backgrounds, demographic factors, as well as their social networks shaped how they attempted undocumented migration journey. And so that encouraged me to go down to the border and to do surveys with undocumented Mexican migrants who tried to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, were apprehended, and then repatriated back to Nogales. So I just want to point out that at the time, there's not a lot of scholarly research, particularly survey research, that was available on the undocumented migration journey in Southern Arizona. Most of our insights have come from scholars who were doing work in, for instance, the El Paso area or the San Diego area. So there wasn't a lot of information about the crossing experience here in Southern Arizona. So that encouraged me to go down to the border and do surveys with migrants, again, who tried to cross the border, were apprehended, and then were repatriated. Now, as you can see, we've seen a constant level of border crosser deaths in southern Arizona since 2000. And more recently, we've seen a notable increase in the last couple of years. And this is really important. I'll return to this comment towards the end of the presentation to offer some insights in terms of why I think this is happening. But anyway, so in 2007, on the tail end of some of this research that we were doing at the medical examiner's office, I assembled a team of graduate students and research assistants, and we traveled to the U.S. Mexico border, namely to Nogales, Sonora, to do surveys with migrants who tried to cross, were apprehended, and were repatriated. And our main aim here was to gather quantitative data on the crossing experience in southern Arizona. So what we ended up doing is we visited a migrant shelter in Nogales that was several kilometers from the actual port of entry. Typically, this shelter would open right around 6 or 7 in the evening, and then would people would eat and then settle in for the night. So what we would do is we would go to the shelter, get everybody signed in, help serve meals, and then once we'd have a little bit of downtime, we would approach the shelter guests and invite them to participate in the survey. And in order to participate in the survey, a person needed to be at least 18 years of age, be from Mexico, and then have attempted a border crossing, been apprehended, and then repatriated to Mexico within the last 6 months. We're really interested in getting people's insights on people's recent crossing experiences, not necessarily crossing experiences from several years ago or several decades ago. So what we ended up doing is we engaged in a spatial random sampling technique where we just divided the shelter up into different corridors and then randomly selected among people present, invite them, screen them for eligibility, and invite them to participate. Now, this survey was quite extensive, lasted about an hour, and it included roughly 250 questions. And so we asked folks about the context and the conditions of their recent crossing attempt, their experiences during apprehension, processing, detention, and repatriation, their knowledge of and exposure to humanitarian aid organizations, as well as anti-immigrant vigilantes that were quite prevalent and present at the time, like the Minimum Project. We also paid notable attention to the role of religion in people's decisions to migrate, as well as during the crossing attempt itself. And then we had a module as well on people's demographic backgrounds. So between 2007 and 2009, we made roughly 100 trips from Tucson down to Nogales and back. In a given night, we were lucky to complete 4 to 6 interviews or surveys, again, because of the small window of opportunity, right? We had people signed in at about 6 or 7, they had to eat, and then it was lights out by about 10. So this, being that it was about an hour-long survey, in a given night, on a good night, we maybe would complete 6 surveys. So in all, it took us about 2 years and over 100 trips to complete 415 of these surveys. And we had roughly a response rate of around 97%, which was quite high. So building on the momentum from this project was something that I used for my dissertation at the time. We've published extensively on this project, but I teamed up with one of the research associates on the project, Jeremy Slack, as well as a professor who's now Professor Emeritus in Latin American Studies, Scott Whiteford, to essentially use this methodology and expand it across the U.S. Mexico border, which was essentially the basis of the second wave of the migrant border crossing study. So between 2009 and 2012, Scott, Jeremy, and I put together a team of roughly 60 researchers and 13 institutions along the U.S. Mexico border. And we were able to expand this project from the first round of the migrant border crossing study from funds from Ford Foundation Mexico, which so we're very thankful and grateful for them and their help and support of this project. So this time, our goal was to produce both quantitative as well as qualitative data on the crossing experience, but border wide. And I'll speak to the research sites here in just a second. In addition, we shifted the focus slightly to include various forms of violence that migrants experience during their trajectory, during their northbound journeys, including mistreatment by Mexican officials, mistreatment by U.S. authorities, maybe abuse by coyotes or human smugglers, as well as other migrants or traveling companions. Nevertheless, we're particularly interested in understanding family separation in an era of mass deportation stemming from various border and interior enforcement efforts. In terms of the selection criteria or eligibility to participate, we're still focused on the experiences of Mexican migrants over the age of 18. And this is an important distinction. At the time, the majority of people who were crossing the U.S.-Mexico border were indeed from Mexico, and that has changed substantially across time, which I'll get to towards the end of my remarks. But this time, as opposed to the first wave, we expanded the inclusion criteria quite a bit. We wanted to interview people who had attempted to cross the U.S. Mexico border anytime in the post 9/11 era, had been apprehended by any U.S. authority, either while crossing the border or once they had arrived to their final destination, and then who were also repatriated to Mexico within the past month. So we got a broader range of people's experiences, including people who were recent undocumented border crossers, as well as people who had made it to their destination in the United States, were living and working, and then got picked up maybe due to a random traffic stop, right? So methodologically, the core of this project was really still focused on a survey design. However, my colleague, co-author, collaborator, Jeremy Slack, also completed hundreds of in-depth interviews and months of ethnographic observation along the border, which I think really comes out in the book. So in short, between 2009 and 2012, we completed over 1,110 surveys as part of the second wave of the project. So in all, you can see that we collected close to 1,600 surveys between waves 1 and wave 2. And very similar to the first wave, we had a response rate of about 94%. Okay, so where did we conduct these surveys? As you can see here, we conducted these surveys in Tijuana, Mexicali, Nogales, Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, as well as in Mexico City among people who had been processed and sent back to the interior of Mexico through the Mexican Interior Repatriation Program. So I just want to spend a few moments comparing and contrasting the two samples. The one that we collected in Nogales between 2007 and 2009, and then the one that we completed 2009 to 2012. So how do the two samples compare? As you can see here, they actually compare they're very comparable, particularly as it relates to average age, maybe biological sex, educational attainment, region of origin within Mexico, as well as they line up quite well in terms of lifetime crossing attempts and apprehensions by U.S. officials, as well as prevalence of use of a coyote or a guide. Now, the two samples do vary a little bit in terms of some key components, right? And I think this might partially have to do with expanded selection or inclusion criteria, but it also has to do with ramped up deportation efforts during the second wave of the project, right? We started to see mass deportation really start to take hold right around 2008. So you can see here on average, just from 2007 through 9 to more recently, the average fee that people were paying to coyotes increased substantially. And today it's even much higher. In fact, it's probably close to double what we saw 2009 through 2012. We can see that the average tenure within the United States had increased slightly, again, due to the expanded selection criteria. We also captured in the second wave a larger proportion of people who said that their home was now in the United States. And this is going to be a very important thing to keep in mind. This is a subjective understanding of home. Where do you consider your home to be? Not necessarily do you own property or where do you rent, but the subjective understanding of place attachment, where you consider your home to be. One thing that we did in the second wave that we did not do in the first wave was focus on border as well as interior apprehension programs, right? Namely, whether or not they were processed through Operation Streamline, whether or not they were caught in the interior as a consequence of Secure Communities Initiative, and whether or not they were detained after being processed by U.S. Border Patrol. We also asked whether or not they intended to cross the border again sometime in the future, right? And you can see roughly half of the sample said that yes, in the second wave said that yes, more than half, that they would indeed cross the border again sometime in the future. In terms of some descriptive statistics, that is demographic characteristics of people who participated in the second wave of the project. Again, this is maybe just a quick summary of what we saw in prior slides, but I think you can kind of see the profile of the individual that we're talking about. Largely male, around the age of 32, kind of in the height of their productive years, roughly 8 years of formal educational attainment, earning about $350 per month at the household level. This is collective, monthly household income. We can see that we had about 8% were indigenous language speakers. Roughly half said they had U.S. citizen family members. About a quarter said they had U.S. citizen children, and 1 in 5 said they had a U.S. citizen minor child. And again, about 30% said, my home is located in the United States. It's no longer in Mexico. One thing we also did, what we're really interested in better understanding getting a better sense of where in Mexico people were migrating, where they were crossing, and where they were intending to go in the United States. And to this end, one of my former graduate students, Kelsey Gonzalez, who's a data scientist, created this visualization to help us get a better understanding of this process, right? So just to summarize briefly, migration scholars have typically divided Mexico into 4 main migrant sending regions: north, traditional, central, and south, which you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen. The northern region includes Mexico states that share a border with the United States, as well as the state of Sinaloa. The traditional region includes several west central states in Mexico that have a long history of migration to the United States, even predating the 1942 Bracero program, right? There's this strong socially embedded culture of migration in many places such as Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, Zacatecas, so on and so forth. The central region includes includes Mexico City, as well as surrounding states in the center of the country. And finally, you have the southern region, which includes states in southern Mexico. These are communities that have a much more recent migration history, dating to perhaps the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. These communities also tend to be largely indigenous, which is, I think, one of the reasons we saw, a non-trivial proportion of our respondents spoke an indigenous language. So we can see here, just following the flow of things, we can see where people from each of these regions were crossing along the U.S. Mexico border, whether it be in the San Diego, and this middle column represents the Border Patrol sector of crossing. So whether they're crossing through the San Diego sector, El Centro, Tucson, El Paso, so on and so forth. And finally, we can get a sense of where they were heading. Where in the United States? Were they heading to a traditional destination, a re-emerging destination, or a new destination? So an example of a traditional destination might be California or Texas. A re-emerging destination, immigrant destination, would be a place like Oregon or Washington or Oklahoma. Whereas a new destination would be, for instance, New York, Florida, North Carolina. And this is new destination. These destination types are for Mexican migration specifically. So for instance, you might see New York. Well, New York has a long history of migration, but here we're talking specifically in the context of Mexican migration. So what we found here is that people's social ties, social capital, plays an important role in not only shaping their crossing experience, but also where they're trying to get in the United States, right? So we see people who have strong ties, that is ties to family members, were more likely to be migrating to traditional regions in the United States relative to those that maybe only had friends in the United States. Okay, so what I really want to get to is the heart of this discussion today, really focusing on how effective, if at all, border and interior enforcement programs are. So in the second wave, this is again based on those 1,100 surveys that we did between 2009 and 2012, we posed 2 questions. We asked people towards the beginning of the survey, do you plan on crossing the border within the next week? And here you can see roughly 30% said yes, 55% said no, 15% said don't know. And we have to keep in mind that these individuals are all folks who have essentially been repatriated, who've tried to cross the border within the last, since 9/11 era, been apprehended by any U.S. authority and then returned back to Mexico. So being in the state of limbo at the border, roughly, 1/3 say, yes, I plan on crossing within the next week. And when we expanded this a bit more and say, well, do you think you'll cross the border again sometime in the future? Roughly 55% said yes, 23% said no, and 22% said don't know. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this in just a second because I think this is important. This helps us understand how, in the wake of these escalated border and interior enforcement programs, how, if at all, this is shaping, these programs are shaping people's future crossing intentions. Okay, so what we're really interested in doing here is we're interested in looking at the relationship between, on the one hand, personal ties that people have to the United States. Again, social capital is an important driver of migration versus these interior and border enforcement programs. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just describing our key independent variables that we use for this analysis. You can see again, roughly 30% of the sample, of the analytic sample, said that their home is now located in the United States. It's no longer in Mexico. On average, the typical person who had lived in the United States had lived for about seven years. About 20% had, a U.S. citizen child who was a minor. And in terms of social ties to their U.S. destination, 40% had family there, 44% had friends but no family, and 16% said they did not have any strong ties in their U.S. destination. Okay, so that essentially is trying to capture social capital or social networks in the United States. Now, we're really interested in looking at, again, weighing the relationship or examining the effects that these immigration enforcement programs have on people's future crossing intents. As we can see here, roughly 37% had been detained for a week or longer after being apprehended. And then what I want to take a step back and just provide a little bit of context here on what we mean by the consequence delivery system. So if you recall moments ago, I mentioned that in 1994, the U.S. Border Patrol launched the prevention through deterrence strategy. This was rooted in this idea of general deterrence, this basic idea that we're going to try to make the journey as difficult as possible in these urban crossing corridors. We would thereby essentially funnel people into remote areas where they would either be, they would try to either be deterred from crossing in the first place, and then if they had not been deterred, they'd undergo the journey, realize how difficult the journey has become, and send word back home. So that's a basic idea behind prevention through deterrence. It's rooted in this idea of general deterrence, trying to deter people from crossing the border in the first place. Nevertheless, in 2001, and the U.S. has continued to engage in prevention through deterrence. I want to make that very clear. However, in 2011, the Department of Homeland Security instituted a new program called the Consequence Delivery System. And the Consequence Delivery System is rooted in something we call specific deterrence. So rather than aimed at deterring undocumented border crossers from crossing in the first place, this is aimed at essentially penalizing or punishing people who've tried to cross, right? So it's essentially a multiplier effect, meaning that if you get caught crossing the border, we're going to process you through Operation Streamline, or we're going to charge you with unauthorized entry or re-entry. It's really aimed at trying to deter that individual from crossing the border again in the future, right? So prevention through deterrence is predicated upon this idea of general deterrence. The consequence delivery system is predicated upon specific deterrence, right? So some of the programs within the consequence delivery system include ATEP, the Alien Transfer and Exit Program, where people who are, for instance, apprehended in the Tucson sector are then deported to, let's say, maybe the Rio Grande Valley sector. And the basic idea here is to try to disrupt smuggling networks, right? But you can imagine that if you are laterally repatriated, you still need to try to cross the border to get to your loved ones or to search for work or whatever that might be. This just puts more strain on people, right? And we know that coyotes, human smugglers, operate all up and down the border. So, we really questioned whether or not ATEP would be very effective in deterring people's future crossing attempts. We also have a program, an interior immigration enforcement program called Secure Communities. And the basic idea behind Secure Communities, which has now been discontinued, was at the time, and this was operational, nationwide. It's basically a fingerprint check system, right? So if somebody is apprehended in the interior United States by local law enforcement, they have their fingerprints run against a federal database. And if there's a ping or a match in that federal database with, either FBI or DHS, a detainer is issued for that individual. ICE will issue a detainer requesting that local law enforcement detain that person for up to 48 hours past the time that they normally would have been released, so ICE can take custody of the individual and then deport them. Operation Streamline, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Operation Streamline, as it was operational here in Tucson sector for quite some time. The basic idea here is to essentially charge recent undocumented border crossers with either unauthorized entry, which is a federal misdemeanor, or unauthorized re-entry, which is a felony. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, people process through Operation Streamlined, and most people process and removed from the interior United States through Secure Communities have been criminalized and now have a deportation on their record. What does this mean? That means that if they try to cross the border again in the future, they're facing charges for undocumented re-entry, which is a federal felony, all just for crossing a line in the sand, right? And you can do anywhere from 2 years up to 20 years, depending on priors, if you're caught, processed, and convicted of unauthorized reentry. And finally, we have the Interior Mexican Repatriation Program, or the Mexican Interior Repatriation Program, which essentially somebody caught crossing through the Tucson sector during hot summer months is picked up and then sent back to Mexico City. So we're really interested to see the effects of these programs on people's future crossing intentions. Okay, so this is just recall when we asked people, do you plan on crossing within the next week? This is what we found. Do you think you'll cross the border again sometime in the future? Now I want to focus on this 55%, the 55% who said, yes, I'm planning on crossing the border again. Now, what I'm going to show you next are just bivariate associations, right? So this is comparing among people who said, yes, we're going to cross again within the next week. Okay, so what's the relationship between saying yes and being processed through ATEP, that lateral repatriation program, or being caught as a consequence of interior immigration enforcement programs, or being processed through Streamline, or saying that your home was in the United States? So here we can clearly see that just based on this bivariate analysis, these lateral repatriations were not effective. In fact, people who were apprehended through ATEP or processed through ATEP, roughly 67% said that they're going to cross again within the next week, relative to 53% who said that they weren't processed through that program. We see no difference here between being processed through secure communities or being caught as a consequence of secure communities. No difference between people who were streamlined versus people who weren't streamlined, but we see a huge difference between people who say, yes, my home is in the United States, it's no longer in Mexico. People who said my home is in the US, that's where ahí es donde está mi hogar, that's where my home is. 66% of those folks said that they were going to cross again within the next week, compared to 48% among people who said their home was not in the United States. Okay, so obviously these are just bivariate analyses. So we need to obviously control for other factors that help predict migration, right? So this is what we're doing here. I know that you can't see this very well, so I'm going to just scroll in or zoom in on these first two categories, right? But I want you to keep in mind that we control for all these other factors that might help explain future crossing attempts. Okay, so what do we know? We know that people who have their homes in the United States are anywhere from 2.5 to 3 times more likely to say that they're going to cross again, either within the next week or sometime in the future. People who have more accumulated migration or experience in the United States, also more likely to say they're going to cross again. People who have family in their desired destination, also more likely to say they're going to cross again. This is even when controlling for the specific enforcement programs through which they're processed. On the other hand, we do find a deterrent effect, a relatively robust deterrent effect stemming from being detained. People who say they were detained for a week or longer said they were less interested in crossing again sometime in the future. And ultimately, we see no difference in the long run between secure communities, Operation Streamline. I'll get to this in just a second here. So are there important differences here between saying you're going to cross within the next week versus crossing again sometime in the future? Now, what I want to point to here is the importance of home, right? The importance of home and personal ties to the United States are consistent between these models, right? And although, so that's an extremely strong driver of future migration intentions. And we also need to point out that, yes, indeed, we do see a deterrent effect stemming from detention that appears to be robust. However, I want to speak a little bit about the unintended consequences of a criminalization approach to undocumented immigration. Another thing I want to point out is that people who were processed through Operation Streamline said they were less likely to cross again sometime in the next week. However, that effect went away when we asked more broadly, is it possible you'll cross again in the future? And this is important, right? This is important because although the deterrent effect from Streamline disappears, the mark that one has on their record is long lasting and will follow them, right? So just to kind of bring things together here, we do not yet fully understand the long-term social consequences of a criminalization approach to undocumented immigration. We do know, for instance, though, that the social need to migrate is much stronger than the deterrent effect of detention or removal programs. And simply, people are going to continue to migrate, right? Now, these findings actually suggest that an entire subset of the population is going to have to constantly avoid contact with the state or risk subsequent criminalization, right? These are the people who have been living here the longest, who have been here 10 years plus, who have their homes in the United States, who have family members. They're folks who we should really be working to try to help integrate into U.S. society, but instead we're doing the opposite. We're systematically apprehending, removing, and deporting folks, and in the process criminalizing them. I know I'm almost out of time. I promise I have a couple other comments I want to point out here just to bring everything to a close, right? So where are we now? Well, we know that the last comprehensive immigration reform was enacted in the United States was IRCA in 1986. We know that we've been unable to pass the DREAM Act, right? One good thing that came from the DREAM Act was DACA, right? So, the 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, does currently provide some reprieve from deportation for people who meet the DACA requirements. This has been expanded, and so we know it's constantly being questioned, but we know for the time being, DACA is safe. DAPA, on the other hand, deferred action for parents of DACA individuals, that would have expanded protections quite a bit, but this was essentially struck down by the courts. So where are we today? Well, today we have an estimated nearly 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. We know that immigrant detention, deportation, family separation, and immigrant criminalization remain focal concerns. However, we also know that the nature of migration at the border has changed substantially over the past decade. And we know that there's been this recent effort to impede access to the asylum system, right? And so what do I mean by this? And if you just bear with me, I'll explain why this is important and what the implications are. But before we do that, I just want to provide this figure. This actually shows nationwide encounters or apprehensions by Border Patrol. It includes returns to countries of origin, and it also includes removals. There's an important difference between returns and removals. Returns don't stay on your permanent record. Removals are essentially deportations, right? So meaning if you get caught with, after being formally removed from the United States, you're likely going to experience criminal charges for unauthorized re-entry, right? So we can see here that nationwide encounters or apprehensions by Border Patrol essentially mirrored returns for quite some time, but we started to see a disconnect here. We started to see a decrease in voluntary returns back to people's country of origin and a rise in removals or formal deportations. This is during this era of what we call mass deportation. But what you'll notice here more recently is we've seen a huge increase in Border Patrol apprehensions over the last several years. And this, I think, is important to hone in on here. And I want to hone in on these last, essentially going back to 2008 to demonstrate the changing nature of migration at the U.S. Mexico border. So here we collected our data between 2007 and 2012. You can see, generally speaking, the overwhelming majority of people who were crossing the border were people from Mexico. But that started to change. It started to change notably in 2014, right? Not only during the time that we were in the field, we saw not only a large proportion of Mexican nationals, but also a steady decrease in apprehensions. But again, this has changed over time. We're seeing this notable demographic change. We're seeing more diversity in terms of country of origin. A higher proportion of folks who are now at the border are from Central America, namely Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, or seeking asylum, right? Very different than what we've seen in the past. And then if you look at just most recently, in 2011 or 2021, 2022, and these are the 22 data are just, they only go up to July of 2022. So we have now seen more encounters in 2022 or apprehensions by Border Patrol than we have in ever, essentially, along the U.S. Mexico border, right? So this is just the overall numbers. Now I want to show the proportion, right? So again, you can see the proportion of Mexican folks who are apprehended at the border has decreased quite a bit, right? And we've seen this increase in diversity, right, of asylum seekers. So in 2014, for those of you that recall, in July 2014, we saw the so-called Central American migrant crisis, where in July of that year, thousands of unaccompanied minors were crossing the border asking for asylum, right? Now, in an effort to deal with this, the state, what has the state done? The state has actually put through several measures to try to impede access to the asylum process in the first place, right? The first being metering, which started in roughly 2016, meaning that if somebody wanted to seek asylum, they would have to go to a port of entry to do a credible fear interview. But there, CBP would say we only take X number of people per day. You have to join this informal list, right? This idea of getting people in queue to wait to do a claim. Another program that essentially was started right around 2018-19 was the Remain in Mexico policy, right? Meaning that asylum seekers who have passed through credible fear interviews would then be returned to Mexico, where they would wait their immigration hearing and then would have to come back to the United States to do that. In the past, people would be able to go and live with their loved ones and work or stay temporarily until their immigration court date. Now, MPP or Remain in Mexico has prevented people from being able to do that. And then most recently is Title 42 expulsions, right? So under the pretext of preventing the spread of COVID-19, the Trump administration re-implemented Title 42 expulsions, meaning that it doesn't matter if you're an undocumented immigrant or an asylum seeker, you can be processed through Title 42 and simply returned back to Mexico. So there's been systematic effort by the state to try to impede people's access to the asylum process in the first place. And why is this important? Well, I think this is notably important. Well, here you can also see in terms of more recently, we've seen notable increase in proportion of Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans who are now being apprehended at the border. So it's very different than what we've seen in the past. Why does this matter, particularly Title 42? Remember when I mentioned the migrant deaths at the beginning of the presentation? I am convinced that Title 42 specifically and the state's broader efforts to impede access to the asylum process in the first place is leading to higher rates of migrant death in the United States, higher rates of along the U.S. Mexico border, higher rates as well as more people dying. What's happening here, what we suspect is people are coming to the border, are essentially trying to present themselves to do a credible fear interview or turning themselves into Border Patrol. Border Patrol then processes them through Title 42, sends them back to Mexico, and now people are stuck. And so what other options they have? They can't go home because they're fleeing violence. The other option they have is to try to cross the border again. And this time they're taking, the second, third, fourth time, they're taking even more remote journeys in order to avoid detection, right? And so I'm convinced that one of the unintended consequences of Title 42, one of the many unintended consequences of Title 42 in this broader effort to impede access to the asylum system has been this increase in border crosser deaths here in Southern Arizona in the last couple of years. Right. All right. So just to bring everything to a close here, we know that immigration enforcement programs have been largely, ineffective. In other words, the subjective understanding of home and these social ties to the United States are strong predictors of future crossing attempts. Nevertheless, because of these immigration enforcement programs, hundreds of thousands of immigrants have been criminalized, right, and are going to have to constantly avoid contact with the state or risk further criminalization. And we need to think about what this is doing, not just to individuals, but families and even entire communities, the systematic effort to try to criminalize immigration. Now, obviously, most recently, the nature of migration at the U.S. border has changed drastically, right? We've seen an increase in diversity. We've seen in terms of country of origin, we've seen an increase in family units. We've seen an increase in unaccompanied minors. Migration today at the border looks substantially different than when we were in the field doing our work for in the shadow of the wall, right? So this is my call to future researchers. We need to get back into the field. We need to go back down and we need to start, understanding what the effects of the state's effort to try to impede access to the asylum system, what this is doing to folks, what is a lived experience on the ground. So with that, I know I went way over, but I apologize. I'd be happy to address any concerns, questions that you might have. Thank you.
You have a question in the chat,
ATEP,
Dan, to explain
ATEP,
ATEP, please.
ATEP is the Alien Transfer and Exit Program. So this is essentially what we call lateral repatriations, meaning let's say somebody crosses through the Tucson sector, Border Patrol will then pick them up, process them, and then they'll deport them or repatriate them to another sector, maybe the Rio Grande Valley sector or the San Diego sector. And the basic idea here is they want to try to disrupt smuggling circles and try to distance them from their coyotes. But the reality is we know they're coyotes or human smugglers all up and down the border, right? The nature of coyotaje has changed drastically over the past several decades. It was gone from being more communally based on kinship ties and communities of origin to now we see the emergence of border business coyotes, human smugglers operating all along the border. So in my opinion, ATEP has been relatively ineffective because the social need to migrate is still there. You haven't done much to disrupt those quote unquote smuggling networks because migrants are able to, find coyotes everywhere along the border. In fact, not only do they find them, but the coyotes look for them and essentially, so it's putting even more pressure on the migrants, right? Metering, on the other hand, is focused specifically on asylum seekers, right? Recent asylum seekers. And this started in 2016. And the basic idea here is that in order to do a credible fear interview, you have to go present yourself at a port of entry. But CBP, Customs and Border Protection, said, okay, we're only going to do X number of credible fear interviews in a given day. We're only going to take X number of asylum seekers in a given day. You have to join a queue, right? So a lot of NGOs, a lot of different entities across the border had these informal lists where people would be waiting months at a time in order to go to the port of entry to do their credible fear interview. So you can imagine that being stuck at the border, if not being from Mexico, maybe not being from northern Mexico, being from somewhere else, maybe somewhere else in Latin America, and being just kind of stuck in the state of limbo for quite some time, you may give up on your asylum case and decide to cross the border and try to avoid detection, right? So that was metering, and then we had Remain in Mexico come in 2018-19, and then most recently these Title 42 expulsions. So I really want to just emphasize, I think a lot of the same basic conclusions that we arrived at in our book about the relative ineffectiveness of border and immigration enforcement programs in terms of deterring people from engaging in undocumented migration, that still holds. I think this recent effort to criminalize immigrants, I think those findings still hold. But what we don't do in our book is essentially get at this recent demographic transition, this major transition. We've seen things change drastically over the last 10 years, namely the rise of quite a bit of diversity. We're seeing people cross from all parts of Latin America, even all parts of the world. This increase in asylum seekers, this increase in family units, this increase in unaccompanied minors when compared to just a decade prior, or 15 years ago, when it was largely my apprehensions along the border were largely of Mexican males, roughly around the age of 30, 32. It's a very different picture today, right? So yeah, I just want to, So the other question, oh yeah.
Maybe, let's see, I want to encourage folks to please put questions in the chat. We can run a few minutes late if you have questions, so please do that. If you do need to leave at 4 o'clock, we just want to say we really, really appreciate you being here. We thank you so much. The next talk is going to be Dr. Shannon Speed, who is the Director of American Indian Studies at UCLA, and she will discuss her book, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women Migrants and Violence in the Settler Colonial State. If you're inspired to donate, Michael will drop a link in the chat, and every donation, whether it's $1, $5, a lottery ticket, anything you've got, we appreciate it, we value it. And if you can't donate right now, we appreciate you being here and being part of making change, because this cannot happen without you. So I just wanted to say those for folks who need to leave by 4 o'clock, but otherwise, please put your questions in the chat. And it sounds like we have some interesting ones coming up. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to talk about reclaiming the conversation and the questions that have come in since then.
All right, so I think one question you had was, okay, so it seems very difficult to, or really difficult to reclaim the conversation about border enforcement. Are there strategies or talking points that you found that can make a difference? Well, to be honest with you, so after we came out of the field, we released a big report through the Center for Latin American Studies here at the University of Arizona, which I think we released that, in 2013. And then this book came out much later in 2018. But based on this report that we published through the Center for Latin American Studies, we had an invitation to go and talk to Congress and to meet with several policymakers on both sides of the aisle, as well as we met with folks at Customs and Border Protection headquarters to really pitch some of our talking point, or our main findings, right? So I quickly realized, at the time I was actually living in Washington, D.C. I was an assistant professor at George Washington University, so that allowed me to be able to travel to Capitol Hill quite often, and talk with folks. All right, so my insights in terms of spending time on Capitol Hill, spending time in Washington, D.C., is that unfortunately immigration has become this political football that just gets punted back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. I am convinced that we have the capacity, we have the resources, we have the technological capabilities to document every single person who's coming across the border, know where they're coming from, know where they're going, know where they're going to be residing, know where they're going to be working. We have the capacity to do that. What we don't have is we do not have the political will, right? The political will has not been there. At the end of the day, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of this does boil down to race making, racialization, the conceptualizations of who is a real American and who is not. I think that's clearly guiding a lot of these discussions. in this post 9/11 era, unfortunately, immigration for some reason has gotten merged with the idea of enforcement. The basic idea is that we need to heavily fortify the border to prevent the next 9/11. Nevertheless, just none of the 9/11 hijackers were undocumented immigrants, right? They didn't cross the U.S. Mexico border, right? But for some reason in policymakers' minds, they've forever equated 9/11 and border enforcement as preventing future terrorist attacks for some reason. That's going to be I think we're starting to see movement away from that. But what we do know is that once border enforcement takes place, it's really difficult to budge. It becomes a new status quo, it becomes a new baseline, right? And that's why I'm very worried about the wall, what we're seeing right now with the wall, whether or not we're going to see the wall dismantled, which I think, would be an important step. I don't know. I mean, it just becomes when you have ratcheted up enforcement, it becomes a new baseline and the new status quo. And so it's been very, very difficult. What we found most success in DC, DC is the land of one pagers. If you hand anything to anybody that's more than a page, they're not going to read it. So you have to make your talking points extremely concise and clear and quick. Our main talking point is, undocumented immigrants they have strong social connections to this country. They have established homes, established families, are productive members of society. On average, our immigrant communities tend to be some of the safest communities around. Yet we see this systematic effort to, again, engage in mass deportation and criminalize immigrants, thereby leading to increased insecurity, in our opinion, right? So I know it's been tricky in terms of what are some talking points that work. But I grew really frustrated talking with folks in DC, because when I would go to one end of the aisle, I was just preaching to the choir. They just wanted to repackage what I had to say to fit their agenda. When I went to the other side of the aisle, they didn't want anything to do with it. It's either border security or nothing. And we're kind of caught in the middle. And again, I think we have the capacity to enact comprehensive immigration reform. What we don't have is a political will. So I think we need to continue to place pressure on policymakers to revisit comprehensive, progressive, inclusive immigration reform that is, also humanitarianly based, right? Yeah. Idam has a question. Were you able to review number of granted asylum petitions versus non-granted have decreased, to confirm what you mentioned about the increase in detention? So, we didn't necessarily focus in our study, we didn't focus on asylum seekers per se. This is a new area of research that we would like to eventually get into. The folks that we talked to were primarily were exclusively undocumented Mexican migrants, right? They weren't necessarily asylum seekers. So I can't really speak to that question, but I think it's definitely something that is worth looking into. Other questions? I will do a shameless plug. If anybody's interested in reading any other of the work that we have, you can find my work on researchgate.net or academia.edu. You can look at my CV on my faculty profile page on the sociology website at the University of Arizona. I make everything I publish publicly available. All you have to do is just send me a link and I'll send you a chapter, I'll send you an article, whatever you want access to. I think it's important for us, for our work to get outside of academia and to be able to reach broader communities. And that's something that I'm committed to more broadly, is engaging in what we call public sociology, making sure that, our research can inform not just policy, but also it can inform, voters, I think is an important thing to kind of keep in mind.
And Michael, just put a link in the chat to the homepage where you can find Dan.
Mm-hmm. And Michael says he has a question. Or no, I'm sorry.
Michelle, put your question. Let's hear, please.
If you don't mind, I'll just speak it. That'll be easier for me.
Sure.
I guess I was wondering on that note, what do you think immigrant rights organizations, advocates, activists, and other folks can take from these findings to inform the work that they're doing to get, humane immigration reform, especially given that it seems like it's really like horrifying, but immigration seems to be more of a like you said, political football, and it's more this game between Republicans and Democrats than it is really actually focused on effective policies. So
that's a great question. So what I would recommend is I don't think that there's like one blanket approach. What I do know is that policymakers are very interested in data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. They're interested in data. They're also really interested in personal stories, right? I think that also is particularly moving. So for folks who work closely with immigrants, immigrant communities, who work with NGOs, you have access to the community. You have access to this extremely important resource, right? I think documentation. I think documentation is key. Whether, for instance, No More Deaths has been doing abuse documentation for quite some time. I think this is so crucial, right? Again, I think in terms of getting people's stories and getting data, and also working closely, identifying scholars or researchers who you can envision being allies, and inviting them to share their work with you and think through what you can do to try to advocate for change. I think that's huge, right? And it's going to vary by NGO and community, and it's going to vary quite a bit across the board. But again, I think the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind, when it comes to our work is, okay, these interior and border enforcement efforts during the time that we're in the field were disproportionately negatively affecting those who were most closely tied to the U.S., right? Those who had lived here for a long time, who had U.S. citizen kids, those who had the subjective understanding of home in the United States. These are the folks that the state should be working to try to include, try to integrate into our communities. And essentially what we're doing is we're doing the opposite. It's almost like this, the irony of social control, in the sense that by engaging in mass deportation, family separation, immigrant criminalization, you're essentially going to promote the very behaviors and outcomes that you're trying to deter in the first place, right? By putting people in these precarious situations, right? We need a complete rethinking of our approach. So that's my comments on the work that we've done through the Migrant Border Crossing Study. More recently, with the work on focusing on asylum seekers, we need to keep in mind that asylum seekers, people have the right, they have a legal right, according to U.S. law, to seek asylum in the United States, and according to various international treaties, right? So what does this mean? This means, the fact that the state is trying to impede people's access to that process, whether it's through metering, Remain in Mexico, or more recently Title 42. It's clear, the state claimed that they were reenacting Title 42, due to try to prevent the spread of COVID-19. It's clear what they want to do is they don't want to essentially address the issue at hand, and is that people have a right to seek asylum in the United States, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be granted asylum, but what it does do, if people are allowed to essentially have their claim, have their fair shot in court, it buys them a little bit of time to be able to try to make their claims, right? And the state, I don't even think wants to go there. I don't know if I answered your question. I think it's a extremely important question. I think it's a critical question, but I encourage folks who are closely connected with NGOs or immigrant rights groups or immigrant community, document. I think that's really important. Get these voices out there, right? Get people's experiences out there. I think that's the only way. And, obviously, try to get people to be civically engaged, I think, is also very important. But I think it's easy to otherize, to make other our immigrant brothers and sisters, right? It's easy to do that. But what we need to do is, we need to show, illustrate the humanity, right? And that's something that I think I often fail to do, and I'm trying to get better at doing it. But when I do a lot of work on border crosser deaths, right, and it's easy to get lost in those numbers. We know that over 3,700 people's remains have been recovered from Southern Arizona in the last 30 years, the majority in the last 15, 20 years. It's easy to get lost in those data. We have to keep in mind each one of those individuals, somebody's mom, somebody's dad, somebody's brother, somebody's sister, somebody's loved one, right? And the impact that this is having spreads beyond the individual into communities, into families, entire communities. I think that's key, right? And so anyways, not to go on, but I think, making sure that we can give voice to people who need that platform, right? And making sure it's their voice, not ours, not through our lens, but elevating their voices and making policymakers realize and recognize that importance.
Do we have a final question? Because we have time for this important conversation.
I could ask one. I've always had a suspicion. Oh, somebody else has got their hand up, though.
Maggie has her hand
That's
up.
quite all right. Please go ahead.
I've always had a suspicion that one of the reasons the Republican Party is so really set against welcoming our brothers and sisters especially from the South, is because they don't want them all to become Democrats. Now, I know that my understanding is the Hispanic, saw something on it recently where the Hispanic community, the Republicans are gaining influence in that community. But am I right on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've heard that before. I've heard that as well, but you're absolutely spot on in the sense that, Republicans have made substantial gains among Latino voters over the last several elections. We do know that, Latinos, not at the same rate as African Americans, but we do know that Latinos do tend to vote in general elections more with the Dems, but they are like 70% usually, but they are making substantial gains among the Republican Party. I think that's part of it. I also think an important discussion, as I mentioned in some of my remarks, should center on race and racialization and racialized others. I think the Republican Party, or certain parts of the Republican Party have a basic idea, and not just the Republican Party. I think Americans in general have this conceptualization of what it means to be a true American, and I don't fit that profile. Other people don't fit that profile, right? We've been here for generations. Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, but they don't fit this profile of this ideal American. It's I think, and that taps into issues of race, ethnicity, nationality, nationalism. And again, it speaks to, these broader conceptualizations of us versus them, in-group, out-group, boundary construction and maintenance. I don't think, I think we cannot lose sight of that. I think that's important. The United States as a racialized project and race making, I think is important to keep in mind too.
Yeah, I've done some reading recently on Christian nationalism, and I've just learned about it within the last year. That is becoming a real challenge, and that's really what you're speaking to. Yeah,
I think you're right. Yeah,
Maggie, you get the final question.
I have to think about, how to differentiate between comment and question, right?
No, you don't.
oh, both are
They're
welcome.
all good.
So I am a federal employee, and I want to state that I'm not currently on my work time. I live in Tucson. I'm from Tucson. I just moved back, and I work for the Department of Health and Human Services, but I keep an East Coast schedule. So it was 6 o'clock when your lecture started. I'm also a graduate of Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. So I have a kind of bivocational life. I think Sister Darcy and I may have spoken when I was here on a personal retreat in 2020. And I asked Borderlinks to help me too. I spent 2 days talking with one of your Borderlinks staff, just talking about the reality of what was happening here. So I just want to contextualize in that. I think the challenge, I'm listening to you talk about the difficulty of getting a one-pager through in Washington, D.C., right? And I'm also thinking about the very, very valid and human things that you're saying, that we should all, human beings should care, where is this insensitivity? How has it been built over such time, where the lives of human beings and the real compassion and the real ties that they have are not seen. But I agree with your racial, analysis there. And the thing that also comes up for me is what will motivate us to find pathways for people to come here legally. It's all these workarounds are very problematic, because, for example, I want people with DACA to get pathways to citizenship, but I also don't want their parents to be criminalized, even in the minds of people, as though they made a mistake or did something wrong. We have all these different angles that we're trying to make arguments about what should be happening, but I worry sometimes that we're reinforcing this idea that the family connections or the way people come through family connections is somehow a problem, and it shouldn't be. So, I just wanted to highlight that, because I think on the deeper level of racism in the country and the rhetoric, as you know, neo-Nazis and other groups have decades of rhetoric that they've been spreading against the connections and the families.
Yeah,
Just
so it's,
comment.
yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of, the family, family stage migration or family chain migration, and people
Yeah.
criticizing that. And, and the reality is that migration is a social process. We know that social capital plays an important role in initiating, facilitating, and sustaining migration flows. I mean, that's undeniable. We see that, across the world, across time, right? It's that's an important part of it. But yes, it becomes this this essentially weak chain in the armor that certain segments of policymakers can try to, oh, see, you said it yourself, sociologists, that we got to stop family migration. And that's not what I'm saying,
Yeah,
because at the end of the day, by trying to separate families, you're just going to push people into even more precarious positions, right? They're gonna seek out even greater risks. The reality too is I think I should probably mention, so I really do think the racialization is an important part of what we're seeing here. Another part of what we're seeing too is this overwhelming sense of ontological insecurity that I think a lot of people in the United States, a lot of, and this isn't, and because of this ontological insecurity, immigrants become a convenient scapegoat. But for instance, over the last several decades, we've seen, increased automation, increased outsourcing, essentially displaced people. We've seen the contraction in the manufacturing sector. Those lost jobs are not being made up, by one-to-one replacement in service sector jobs, in terms of, in terms of wages, in terms of retirement benefits, so on. So I think, in the past, and I'm thinking here of for instance, my father-in-law, who didn't even graduate from high school, who ended up working in pulp and paper and did very well for himself without a high school degree, right? That those days have come and gone, right? You can't do that anymore. And so I think what ends up happening, because of capitalism's constant search for lower inputs and higher profits and going abroad and automating, I think that's displaced and alienated a non-trivial proportion of the segment of the population in the United States, right? And I think that sense of ontological insecurity is magnified because of, again, globalization, outsourcing. Then, we see images of people who don't look like us coming across the border, coming to the United States. They must be taking our jobs, otherwise why are they here, right? And so I think that is also, I think race matters, but I also think this sense of ontological insecurity because of globalization, technological innovation, or outsourcing, automation. I think that's an important part of it too. And I think that's why a certain, the former president really appealed to certain sense of, certain segment of the population that felt like they essentially were entitled to something that they were promised something and they're not getting it anymore, right? I think that's another part of this that we need to think through. Anyways, you gave me a lot to kind of consider here. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
I didn't pose a question because I was just trying to work with this grappling. What I'm trying to think is what would motivate people to change at the policy level. And I was thinking about what would create pathways to legally bring people, people would have a chance and they wouldn't have to put their lives on the line. But
I mean, here we are, since 1986 was the last time we saw comprehensive immigration, inclusive immigration reform. Yet a lot of people look at IRCA as kind of being this, like, almost look back on IRCA very fondly, saying, oh, well, it regularized the status of 3 million people. But we have to keep in mind that IRCA also essentially ushered in a new era of increased border militarization. It was after IRCA that we saw the prevention through deterrence strategy take off. The basic idea is we can't let undocumented immigrant population get to those same levels. So therefore we need to deter people from coming by heavily enforcing the border. But one of the unintended consequences of the border buildup and border militarization was what we call the so-called caging effect, right? In the past, migration used to be largely seasonal. It was largely local to Southern California, parts of Texas. People would migrate for a season. It was largely male dominated, and they would return home. But over time, with increased border enforcement, it became harder and more costly to try to get across the border, that people stopped, doing seasonal migration and started to settle permanently, and then they would have to then, you know, send for their family to reunite. So one of the unintended consequences of this border buildup, border enforcement, was the growth of the undocumented population, which, you know, it was initially intended to, you know, to prevent in the first place. So it really is a mess. And so what's going to change? I think, you know, I think, you know, we need to try to work within the system to change it. And how do we do that is by making sure that we, you know, are registered to vote, you know, are civically engaged, are turning up to the polls. You know, I think local politics play a huge role here too. You know, I think local municipalities, local cities, counties have a lot of say in terms of how, you know, and I understand that immigration is a federal matter, but we do know that there are a lot of local level policies that are enacted, whether it be driver's license or social services at the local level, or whether it be limited cooperation policies between local law enforcement and federal officials when it comes to immigration enforcement. I think the local level matters too, right? So I think we can, you know, oftentimes it's easy to get disillusioned and lose hope and say, well, it's a federal issue. We're never, this political party is never going to be in a position to be able to affect change. And I think we can start making change too at the local level, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
I believe that.
That is a beautiful place to leave us to reflect.
Well, thank you all. I
Thank you
appreciate it.
so much, Dan, for sharing your expertise and helping us to think through what information do we have, what do we need, and what can we do. And I thank all of you, because having these conversations is also part of how we think it through and keep working to make a change. So please join me in giving a huge thank you. Thank you so much to Dan
thank
for
you,
being with
Border Leagues.
us.
Thank you for all the work you do. Extremely important. I really appreciate it. Truly. Thank you.